Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode, I discuss two papers in Free Will and Moral Responsibility by Galen Strawson and Derk Pereboom with two non-philosopher friends, Adam and Giffen, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. So, this is the third episode in the Free Will and Moral Responsibility series, and we talk about two arguments in this episode, Derk Pereboom's four-case argument and Galen Strawson's basic argument. So the funny thing is that, this episode was recorded around a year ago, as were the other two. And the funny thing is that I've come around to be very interested in compatibilist distinctions generally, but very interested in character coherence, second-order desires, and reasons responsiveness, all three of which I kind of flippantly dismissed in this episode. So in this episode, I hinged one of my arguments on this sense of could have done otherwise. Now, this importance of the argument changes after our episode on Frankfurt's Principle of Alternate Possibilities, which will be later in the series. So, this is a fun episode, I think. I really enjoyed recording it. And if you disagree with me, well, you're in good company because I disagree with myself from this episode. So with that introduction, I hope that you enjoy part 3 of the series. Just a quick introduction to the episode. We actually start out talking about this comical, or at least I think comical, set of tweets by Bret Weinstein. This episode was actually recorded on March 9th of 2021, so the tweet had to be before that date. And obviously these are not amongst the craziest things that Bret has tweeted, but just so that you know what we're talking about in the intro, Bret tweeted, quote, "All else being equal, should we expect more arguments over determinism to take place within a deterministic universe or a stochastic one?" He then retweeted his own quote and said, "I believe a deterministic universe wouldn't contain arguments of any kind. Arguments over determinism, therefore, require indeterminacy. I expect to lose the argument, though, but not because I'm wrong." So, I, upon seeing that tweet, sent it to my co-hosts, and we had a bit of fun discussing that before we get into the more substantial part of the episode, which is a fun discussion of two very influential views by Derk Pereboom and Galen Strawson. So, as always, I hope you enjoy this episode.
That picture you sent of Bret Weinstein, it was so dumb. Like, I also just like the kind of if-then structure to it.
Oh my god, just a faux logic?
Yeah, I believe a deterministic universe wouldn't contain arguments of any kind. So he believes that. Okay, he doesn't give any reasons, but he believes it. So I believe a deterministic universe wouldn't contain arguments of any kind. Arguments over determinism, therefore, require indeterminacy. I expect to lose the argument, though, but not because... and you notice, like, these, very intentional... Yet the comma, just like, I expect to lose the argument, comma, though, comma, but not because I'm wrong.
Oh my god.
I expect to lose the argument.
I think I followed that, like, I sent you guys the screenshot of that tweet, and I followed it up with, like, I actually used to be a fan of Bret Weinstein's. Like, when he first came out, like, I got sucked into the same trap that I did with Jordan Peterson, where, like, I saw a guy making some pretty reasonable claims about some pretty mundane topics, and I was like, oh, this guy's kind of reasonable. And then just, like, but honestly, more of his brother, Eric, like, they both have just made me so, it's like, the problem with those two, but this is more about, like, Eric, I guess, than Bret, but it applies to him too, is, like, they make me, they want people like me to follow them in spite of what they tweet. Like, not for it. It's like the only reason I have for following those people is to maintain some aspect of, like, diversity of information in my diet. Like, that's it. Or, like, diversity of viewpoints. I shouldn't even say information. Like,
Yeah, I mean, the formula for, like, becoming a quote unquote public intellectual is like pretty easy at this point. Just like attack a group that most people hate, just to get kind of like a rabid fan base.
Yes.
And then at that point, you're golden. Like, I mean, regardless of what you think about like the ethics of veganism, if I went out hard against vegans and just like laughed at them and like had a whole channel dedicated to that, with my I could employ a bunch of faux arguments, just being like, they want to take away the cows, like they don't even respect it. And then, but actually that's wrong though, because I want to be a public intellectual. I'd have to kind of like, glossy up the language a little bit, and like they don't recognize, the cultural heritage of meat eating throughout the West for thousands of years. Like I can say nonsensical things like that.
This is one step away from the 1619 project. Take away our cows or whatever. It's like
referencing previous past regarding this. So.
That tweet, like I saw that tweet, and honestly, I almost had to refresh my Twitter feed because I was like, this loaded wrong. Like.
You know what I thought was funny about the tweet?
What?
Because like the quote you read was kind of in response to his own tweet from like 40 minutes ago. And I just imagine him sitting, like not knowing the answer when he tweeted the first time, sat for 40 minutes thinking, and then that was the response after 40 minutes of deep thinking.
It's like, dude, it the original tweet's almost reasonable. It's not. I mean, it's closer to being reasonable, but he said it was a statistical frequency question. It was like, all things being equal, should we expect more arguments over determinism to take place within a deterministic universe or a stochastic one? That I can't imagine the answer to that shaping my views on anything else. Like, I just can't imagine caring about the answer to that question. I don't know. The problem I have with someone like Brett, and it's more brought out in the retweet than the original tweet, is like, just look at that tweet for a second though. I believe a deterministic universe wouldn't contain arguments of any kind. Like, just actually think about that claim for like that. It's almost so difficult to explain how deeply wrong that is. Like, the idea that I don't even know if this is worth talking about. Like, the idea that a deterministic universe would unfold so as the determined creatures in it. Like, am I crazy in thinking the odds of that are less than improbable? like they're damn near impossible.
Yeah, and what's like the converse he's arguing for here, that like indeterministic universes would somehow just bring about arguments? Like,
why couldn't I just retweet that and say, I believe in an indeterministic universe there would be no arguments over determinism? Like, what's the problem with just doing that? Like it's
nothing.
Like, literally not. Like, it has just as much basis as his tweet.
I'm a fan of the last sentence. I expect to lose the argument, though, but not because I'm wrong. Doesn't mean you can apply to any context, and it's just hilarious.
You can put that sentence at the end of any other sentence.
I know, it's great. That's probably the best sentence I've ever read, honestly, in its utility.
The thing that kind of pisses me off, like genuinely, is these guys do such a bad job of representing any debate, because it's like, I mean, look at what we're about to do. Like, we're about to just discuss like two kind of groundwork papers from two really smart philosophers. Like, we can agree, we can disagree, but there's no place in which to stand where we can accuse either of them of being like uninformed or quixotic about the debate, or we just can't do that. But Brett thinks that like apparently this is worth tweeting about. Like, in whatever it is, 240 characters, he thinks he might actually add something to the debate of determinism.
Yeah, no, like, I think that puts it pretty well too. I mean, like, I don't know how long Strawson or Pereboom spent, formulating their arguments. It was probably over a long period of
decades.
Time. Yeah, after decades of reading others' arguments on the very subject, like, and this guy just like within 40 minutes, I've got it, I figured it out. Like,
And like imagine taking into consideration a tweet from a canceled biologist who had never heard, like no one had ever heard about him until like a bunch of like unhinged students at Evergreen made him famous. Put yourself in the frame of mind who's someone who has a view about determinism, and that view is shifted based on this tweet. Like I can't imagine that.
It'd be pretty funny to encounter this view in the wild, though. Someone like you're like debating this topic, and someone's like, "Well, I believe that arguments could never take place in a deterministic universe." You're like, "Why?" Just asking a simple follow up, and you've already stumped. Just given no reasons to buttress.
But imagine we are in a deterministic universe. Or I'm sorry, we are in a stochastic or indeterminate universe. Why? Because arguments couldn't take place if it were determined. What?
You have to have a weird definition of argument for this to even be coherent to me.
But I mean that actually though.
I'm not joking. I don't even know if this makes any sense unless you completely redefine argument.
This honestly just makes me this brings out my inner nihilist more than anything else. Just burn it all down. If this is what we're going to do, if this is what we're going to do with the internet, just burn it down. I don't know. It just makes me depressed to see shit like that.
Yeah, it was a pretty bad tweet.
I wouldn't be embarrassed to defend anything I said there. Yeah. Brett. If you what are you doing? Moratorium on that tweet. I'm closing the window so I don't accidentally catch it out of the corner of my eye. We're discussing just better things. Yeah. Oh my god. All right. So we're continuing the free will series. We left off after the kind of clarificatory part 2 to the part 1, and where we're at this point is just this. So all of us deny any form of libertarian free will. Adam, I remember, were finding it very important to maintain certain types of distinctions in the maybe something like character or even characteristics of persons. And that was something that you wanted to preserve. I agreed with you, and I was expecting you to find those distinctions more interesting for something like the moral responsibility debate rather than the free will debate. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Maybe, because I certainly was there, but I feel like I've conceded everything at this point. I've thrown out any sort of sense of compatibilism at this point. It's gone. It's gone.
Okay. Now, compatibilism. So that's a perfect point to pick up on, because I've been kind of actually thinking about this more with respect to other projects, but it's relevant to this too. I don't know if you guys are as amenable to this as I am, but it seems to me like in a lot of the literature that we read, there's a bit of a conflation between compatibilism about whether, I know I said this before, but I don't know if you guys fully agree or not. It seems like there's a conflation in a lot of this literature between compatibilism, between determinism and free will, or compatibilism between determinism and moral responsibility. I think that those are two separate questions, and they almost seem to be dealt with as one.
Well, I think, though, to be fair, though, when I was reading through the Pereboom summary here,
okay,
Pereboom's 4-case argument against compatibilism,
mm-hmm.
I felt like I was arguing for the moral reasons sensitivity account.
I was.
It's not. I think it's less of a conflation. Can I read that real fast here?
Yeah. Well, should I say? So we're gonna be talking about the Impossibility of Moral Responsibility. That's an essay by Galen Strawson. And then on Philosophical Disquisitions, it's a blog. We're going to read a summary of Pereboom's 4-case argument against compatibilism.
So I feel like I was arguing for this point that, so it's called moral reasons sensitivity account. A decision can be said to be free if it is produced by a decision-making mechanism that is capable of grasping and making use of moral reasons for action. and this is the account associated with R.J. Wallace. It is similar to Fisher and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, his account, but it pays.
You know what's crazy?
Yeah.
I was telling you guys that I had this moment. I've actually emailed R.J. Wallace as well and never put that together, that was the same Wallace from this. I've also John Martin Fisher I've emailed. I think he might have tentatively said he could come on in the summer.
How about Revisa?
Revisa I have not interviewed. He's actually like from what I understand, a devout Catholic and views this from a bit of a religious sense.
Wow.
It could be interesting. Now I should say I actually don't know much at all about Revisa's work, but I haven't emailed him yet. I intend to though. So Adam, I actually agree. I do think that's what you were kind of going for. I want to start with this paper, but let's can I read a quick thing from like the above section? So this is the blog person talking. He says, compatibilists hold that whether a decision is to be judged free or not does not depend on whether the decision was causally determined. This raises the obvious question. If causal determinism has no bearing on the matter, what does? The answer is that a certain type of causal sequence is associated with free and responsible decision-making. If the actual causal sequence leading up to a decision fits this type, then we are entitled to say the decision is free. Now, I think the and in the previous sentence, he says a certain type of causal sequence is associated with free and responsible decision making. I'm not sure that and is specific enough for me, because I believe so. I mean, we'll get into it, but he gives 4 different accounts of ways to preserve this freedom. I don't see any of these as preserving a sense of freedom or free will, but I do see all of these as relevant to the moral responsibility debate. Because to my ear, what that sentence says is certain types of determined actions are free and others are not. This has a little bit to do with the other paper we'll get to, the Impossibility of Moral Responsibility. But I wish that these, instead of saying free, said something like constitutive of moral responsibility, or like deserving of moral responsibility, as opposed to free. Do you get what I'm saying? Is that like at least a coherent thought?
I agree, Jordan. If you're trying to make claims in this realm, you should not use the word free if you're not talking about free will.
But the thing is, I think you could be, but like that's like you like I think that's what a compatibilist on free will is like someone who believes that these constitute, obviously not indeterminacy, but then like we talked about in the previous episodes, they're almost kind of redefining free will to mean X, whether it's the character, second order reasons responsive, or moral reason sensitivity account. I would almost rather preserve like a very clean sense of, if it's not libertarian free will, then sure, we can argue that these things could be like compatibilist notions of free will. But I'd rather say that like, okay, there's no libertarian free will. We're just working with determinism here. Let's not worry about whether something is free will or not. That's almost like a semantic game. Let's work on determining if certain accounts of how people are is something that should be deserving of moral responsibility.
I actually really get where you're coming from, Matt. What you said made a lot of sense, because a compatibilist, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that a compatibilist is trying to reconcile libertarian free will with the fact of determinism. Therefore, and we all kind of agree that libertarian free will is kind of a load of bunk. So it's like, let's actually work entirely within the domain of determinism and not even focus on the free will, considering we all kind of reject that part outright. Because
close.
Okay.
One clarification. Compatibilists about free will aren't trying to preserve libertarianism or any sense of that.
They're trying to reconcile the two, though, right?
It depends what you mean by reconcile. They're trying to locate a notion of free will within a deterministic framework, as opposed to being an incompatibilist and just saying like, no, we don't have any sense of free will. But that doesn't mean we can't then talk about like moral responsibility.
Okay, well, at the very least, they're preserving the language of free will.
Yes, which I'm claiming is kind of, I don't know if I see the point of that.
Yeah.
Like I don't know like what, because to me, and like I could be missing something super obvious in the literature here, but like to my ear, whether or not like let's say we actually hash it out for 2 hours or whatever, and we come down to a conception of free will that can be preserved while admitting that determinism plus randomness is true. And we come down to like maybe one of these 4 accounts, right? And we think that's what free will is. Okay, but then we haven't even opened with the discussion. All we've settled on is what we want to call free will. Like we haven't settled on the discussion of moral responsibility at all, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'll have to do some research, but like I don't know if there's actually a kind of like a rich literature on that we are missing or not. I have not come across any paper that really lays it out in those terms. Let's just try to be specific. I still think all of these arguments are like worth talking about, but maybe even like we can be specific between each other what we mean. Because so there's like a character-based account. There are these 4 compatibilist alternatives to preserving some sense of freedom, and there's a character-based account which says a decision can be said to be free if it is caused by and not out of character for a particular agent. That's, you know, pretty simple. Like they said, it was espoused by David Hume initially. Then there's a more specific idea. There's a second order desire account. And this says a desire can be free if it is caused by a first order desire. For example, I want some chocolate. That is reflexively endorsed by a second order desire. I want some chocolate. This is the account associated with Frankfurt. And I actually said that we're going to read this paper. But that's a slightly more sophisticated account. I think these get kind of more sophisticated maybe as you go down. Then there's the reasons responsive account, which we had discussed last episode, that a decision can be said to be free if it is caused by a decision-making mechanism that is sufficiently responsive to reasons. In other words, if the mechanism had been presented with a different set of reasons for action, it would have produced a different decision, at least in some worlds. And then there's the moral reasons sensitivity account, which says a decision can be said to be free if it is produced by a decision-making mechanism that is capable of grasping and making use of moral reasons for action. And we talked about the people who that's associated to. It pays particular attention to the role of moral reasons in decision-making, so it's even more specific to the reasons responsive account. Now, I want to hear what you guys think about this. When I read all of these accounts, like we said, you know, basically these are all saying, but with different details, if this is your conception of free will and any given action or thought falls into that category, then it can be called free will, which again is like, it's not, I don't know if that's actually the heart of the issue. Now, if you change one word in that claim, it does actually become very interesting. So if any of these is your conception of an action or a characteristic of a person or a constitution of a person that is meaningful to you, then if they fall into that category, that might be what determines if that person is deserving of moral responsibility or not. Like that I find all of these accounts much more interesting if we're talking about moral responsibility. And to be fair to anyone who's like a proponent of these accounts, it could follow, I suppose, that freedom in this sense is just what is linked to moral responsibility, right? Like I guess that could be a way of viewing these too, right? Where you say like these constitute a certain type of freedom, and if that certain type of freedom is met, that warrants moral responsibility. It's just kind of adding an indirect step in between, you know?
Yeah, that's how I was viewing it. But
okay,
and I'm not convinced of free will as we've defined free will and not the redefining of free will. And therefore, I'm ultimately not convinced of any real moral responsibility. So,
Okay, wait. So say that again.
so I said that in the sense that we've defined free will,
as like the pristine case would be libertarian free will.
sure,
Okay.
I do not hold to that at all, and I also think that moral responsibility is thrown out with that as well.
Oh, so okay, so you'd be an incompatibilist about the possibility of moral responsibility in a deterministic universe.
Yeah, at this point, yeah.
Interesting. Before we get into it, just as a teaser, was the Strawson paper persuasive in that view at all to you?
Oh, 100%.
Okay, interesting. That actually almost surprises me. Now I'm very interested to get to that because I had marked out where I thought you might demur, but now I'm curious to see why you didn't. But we'll get to that paper after this one. Now, Pereboom challenges. Interestingly, he kind of actually tackles all of these claims with the same style of argumentation. It's a species of argument that starts with the simple supposition that if a decision by one agent, A, has been manipulated into existence by another agent, B, there is no way that we can say that this decision was freely made by A. Now, he has, like, the blog nicely lays out the formal structure of Pereboom's argument here. This is his formal argument against compatibilism. Premise 1, if one agent's decision is manipulated by another agent, then that first agent's action is not freely willed. 2, now also stop me if you guys object to any of these. 2, there is no difference between manipulation by another agent and causation by a causal factor external to the agent. Premise 3, on determinism's account, all of an agent's actions are determined, which is to say causally influenced, by at least some factors beyond that agent's control. Therefore, premise 4, on determinism, no agent can be said to freely will their actions or be morally responsible for them, from 1, 2, and 3. Premise 5, compatibilism holds that free will and moral responsibility are compatible with determinism. Therefore, compatibilism must be false. I find that to be syllogistically pleasing. Do both of you?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the one that is, I believe, most commonly objected to is that the premise 2 and premise 4. Those are the ones in the literature that are most commonly objected to. That there's no difference between manipulation by another agent and causation by a causal factor external to that agent, and also that what actually matters is determinism or not. Those are the two most kind of objected to. Now he has this 4 case argument, which I find it's a fun argument to go through.
Agreed.
So he says he lays out these 4 cases, and he starts with what is supposed to be intuitively the most obvious, where there should be no moral responsibility, where a neuroscientist directly manipulates the deliberation process of a person, Professor Plum, and he is forced through this manipulation to engage in strong egoistic deliberation processes, and he decides to, for his own gain, kill this person named White. Now, it's also important to understand that Plum would not have killed White had the neuroscientist not intervened, since his reasoning would not have been sufficiently egoistic to produce this decision. Now, this was supposed to be the pristine case of, obviously, Professor Plum is not morally responsible in this. And I assume, well, I know that Adam finds that intuitive. Giffen, you agree, I'm assuming?
I do.
Okay. I do fail. I'm honestly kind of at a loss to coming up with a reason how he could be there. You know? I mean, like... Well, I'm not actually. I know of a philosopher who might say he's still responsible there. But
yeah, I don't. Just if I may, the one thing that kind of caught me, it just instinctively whenever I was reading through, I kind of got like caught on it really quick. It's like the last sentence where it says, otherwise, Plum's decision meets the requirements set down by standard compatibilist accounts of free will. And it said, it is consistent with his character, reflexively endorsed by second order desires, produced by a mechanism that is sensitive to reason, moral, and prudential. I guess whenever I read through that, I'm like, I had to like do a double like take kind of almost. And I was like, wait, does that in this case? Did you guys get like have that reaction? A bit?
That's a fair question. I think now we have to remember this isn't Pereboom's writing. This is kind of a summary of it. So I don't know what the original text would say. I'm assuming that means that basically, from what I understand, the neuroscientist, if that's what you're hanging your hat on, any of those things, one could just have the neuroscientist change those as well. Do you know what I mean? And then it would be consistent with whatever those were.
Okay. I think that makes sense, and that's what I think that's what I like kind of came around to. Like,
sure.
The neuroscientist says, well, now you have that second order desire, right? Okay. I just wanted to bring that up because I did get caught on that like sentence.
Yeah. No, that's a really good clarification, and I do think that it bears. I'm curious what the actual writing of Pereboom makes about that point. But I would have to assume.
Interesting for the rest of the cases too, just to clear that up now.
Then we move to so then there's the second case. So Plum is the same person. He's just this ordinary human being, except that a team of neuroscientists manipulates Plum's deliberative faculties at birth. And so there's this introduction basically of a delta T, like a span of time between the manipulation and the manifestation of that manipulation. So much later in Plum's life, he, for egoistic reasons, for self-serving reasons, due to that earlier manipulation, decides to kill White for his own gain. And it's importantly the same that if this manipulation had not taken place, he would not have done what he did. And so this is supposed to be a very intuitive kind of furthering of the case, where it's like, how on earth are we supposed to locate moral responsibility in just a mere differential in time? Like, how could that? The team of neuroscientists determined that this would happen, and it just didn't happen like later. It
didn't matter if it was like half a second or like half a year or half a lifetime.
Exactly. Now there's a slightly bigger jump into the third case, which is that cultural peers manipulate Plum's deliberative faculties by non-technological means in Plum's childhood. And then, much later, for his own self-serving reasons, he kills Professor White. We're supposed to accept that due to the aspect of his character produced by this training, that is what caused him to do this and have the first and second order desires to kill White in this scenario. And this is supposed to be, okay, well, all we're doing here is we're swapping a clear agent manipulating White for kind of more diffuse cultural reasons, or as we'll see in the fourth case. Now I should say real quick, I think I said this before, but a lot of where philosophers object is on that step.
From 2 to 3.
From 2 to 3.
Wow.
Also, well, I shouldn't say a lot. I don't know what proportion actually, but I'm aware of some philosophers who do actually care that it be an agent doing the manipulating.
Right.
Now, I don't find that convincing, because you can always ask the same questions of that agent, like where did those first and second order desires come from? And I find that to be a question that always basically unravels into the fourth case.
Right. And I was also anticipating when I read this that like someone might get caught up on that as like be for the agent reason. So I kind of like imagined to myself almost a smoothing of like this case curve by adding like a 3.5 or like a 2.5, where instead of like, cultural peers seems like really diffuse, right? It's like, well, you just kind of grow up. But I think it might be interesting to add like, if you are kind of getting caught, even just like emotionally, to imagine that instead of just like kind of vague cultural pressures, you grow up in like a cult, right? That's very strong, I think, reaction you could get. I don't know if that influences any of the audience, but I thought that would make this curve a little bit smoother.
Yeah, it's
Because if
good.
you think like a
Yeah.
true cultish like life that you grew up in is like, allows you to have moral responsibility, like that, I feel like people like will find that less believable than just like kind of vague notion of culture. Even
Yeah.
though to me
Yeah.
it's like the same.
I feel like we could come up with almost I feel like there are almost like 100 or more distinctions in between all of these cases that we could come up with.
Yeah.
And I have the suspicion because obviously it wouldn't be as good a paper if we had to go through 100 case like or
Yeah.
400 cases, but
Right.
like my suspicion is that people who want to because people who want to cut off the slide at some point,
Mhm.
like, oh, okay, hey, case jumping from case 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 is illegitimate.
Right.
I have the suspicion that they would have a harder time figuring out which case when you make it more fine grained to object at.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what kind of I thought the jump from 2 to 3 was like kind of where I can't imagine people at case 1 and 2 like actually like having like huge qualms. So that jump to 3 is like where I like thought, you can imagine like this being a little bit of a stronger, more of a 2.5 to like help those people who were like jarred by the jump.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. You can like kind of bring it into like almost just a continuous spectrum, and then people just kind of get lost.
Don't people kind of have to like deny the like I dare I say it, the fact that people are shaped by their environment and their peer group? Like, I mean, you are who you surround yourself with, or who just happens to surround you. I mean, like, it's just like a causal chain of like the friends you make inevitably influence you, like the household you grow up in, like the neighborhood you grew up on, the community you grow up in, like the country, like everything. Like, wouldn't you have to deny that? Like, how could you deny that?
So libertarians are forced to deny that, I believe, or not to deny it, but at least to say that's all true, but there is some kind of contra-causal ghost in the machine, Deus ex machina or whatever it is, that can overpower all of those factors. I find that obviously implausible because for reasons we talked about the last 2 episodes, compatibilists would say all of that's true, but that's not what matters for either free will or moral responsibility. We want to locate what matters for it somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see that perspective on how you could deny. Like,
well, I guess so we just went through we just went through 4 examples of how to deny that, where you could say that, like, so let's say that obviously your character was shaped by all of those factors you just said, right? We could say that any given decision is free if it's not out of character for you to do. You're smirking, and it's like it's a fair smirk. I'm not defending this. I'm just trying to explain it.
Yeah.
So like, we could say like you're a very frugal guy, you like to save money, and for some like, inscrutable reason you bought like a Gucci purse or something for your wife. And it's like that is very out of character for you. But it would be I agree. It sounds kind of a little bit odd on its face, like, but that's not free. Like,
yeah, I'm also imagining bringing this down to like just infants and toddlers at that point. It's like this toddler like drops a glass of milk. It's like that's very unlike him.
he never
like,
usually does. Yeah.
I mean, like, I'm sure you guys have like seen this phenomenon or at least heard about it, that like children who are molested at a young age will then go on to molest themselves.
Yeah.
So like examining them as adults, like it's in their character to want to molest kids. So therefore they have the freedom, or they have free will because they're acting within character and they want to molest the kids.
And what the more absurd claim is that if they chose not to, it wouldn't be free because it's out of their character to do so. You know what I mean? Like that's
I actually don't know how you could deny case 3 here.
Yeah, that devolves into a weird semantic argument about what character is at that point, right?
Yeah, the interactions you have with people throughout your entire life shape who you are, of course.
Yeah. And then I find this to be less of a jump from case 3 to case 4. Case 4 is basically exactly the same, but substituted cultural, societal pressures for generic external causal factors. So all of the aspects of determinism plus randomness, genes, environment, etc., sun radiation. Those determine Plum's deliberative processes, and due to those, he engages in this strong egoistic deliberation process and kills White for his own reasons. Yeah, so the interesting thing is that as this blog post kind of goes on to say, there's two ways of resisting this argument. There's the rather hard-lined way, which is to say that Plum is responsible in all four cases, which I don't know really how you do that. Then there's kind of a softer line way of resisting this, which is to say that either free will or moral responsibility arises there's some kind of delineation between these cases. And actually, someone who I had on the podcast says that, Ben Burgess, he maintains that there is somewhere in the spectrum where either free will or moral responsibility can arise. And I remember, we were talking about it, and he kept saying that, just because I was asking him, how do you have a structured principle for where you draw the line in this argumentation? And he said that just because there is a gray area doesn't mean that it's impossible to say that the ends of the spectrum aren't different. And he made the I'm curious what you guys think of this. He made the analogy, it's rather apropos, I guess, in this case, that if you can look at this as baldness, for instance. So if Adam is obviously not bald. And so on one end of the spectrum is someone who's clearly has a full head of hair. On the other end of the spectrum is someone, let's not take me because I shave my head, so it's a weird edge case, but someone whose head does not naturally have a single hair on it, Mm-hmm. He says that, there's gray area of when we call someone bald or not. Is it at 1 hair? Are you not bald? Is it at 10? Is it a certain kind of pattern? And he says that, well, it's kind of, I don't know, it's up to interpretation. Where's the delineation between bald or not? And he argues that because there's gray area doesn't mean that there's not clearly a distinction between bald or have a full head of hair. And that it's analogous to the moral responsibility. What do you guys think of that? You're not convinced?
I don't like that analogy at all.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Because all that means to me is that you just didn't discuss what bald means. Once you define bald.
Giffen, you're making a great point that I think circles back to what I said before. What matters to me doesn't really matter if you call bald having 1 hair, 10 hairs, a certain pattern. What you call bald, it doesn't really matter. What almost matters to me is how many hairs do you have?
Right. Yes, exactly.
Yes. Which is
I'm called one bald and call the other bold for all I care, right?
So the analogy there is between the argument over compatibilists' free will, or no, let's move to the moral responsibility case. How many hairs on your head do you have? That's where I think the interesting question is. But okay, let's move to the Impossibility of Moral Responsibility paper, because I'm curious. I have questions for Adam, maybe specifically about this, because I thought he was going to object in certain areas. Now, it's official. We've fully clarified that we're moving on from free will to just straight up moral responsibility. So this is the heart of the issue here. This is what really matters. And basically, the way I'm setting up the rest of the series is I think this paper excellently brings up the potential impossibility of moral responsibility, and subsequent papers we'll read are possible ways of resisting that conclusion. So this is Galen Strawson, who it's actually really funny. Galen Strawson is still he's not that old and teaching today. I think he's older, but not super old. And he's at U of T Austin, I think, which is another program I'm interested in. It's funny because he is a hard incompatibilist on this question. And his father, P.F. Strawson, wrote one of the most kind of formative papers in this debate. It's called Freedom and Resentment. And it's just funny because his the elder Strawson, P.F. Strawson writes in that paper is like directly against what Galen is doing in this paper. It's just a very funny, like
Family Feud.
Yeah, it's a very funny kind of father-son philosophy feud. So this paper is kind of talking about what Strawson calls the basic argument. And this is a nice paper too, because there's no chaff on this. He really just gets right into it. He says in the very beginning, there is an argument which I will call the basic argument, which appears to prove that we cannot be truly or ultimately morally responsible for our actions. Now, this already raises a question. What do we mean by truly or ultimately? It's kind of an open question. We can discuss what these terms mean, but I think what's clear, what we can be sure about in this argument is Galen Strawson, he's not holding out for something better. Like if he could believe in any form of moral responsibility, it's going to be corrupted by this argument, you know? Like there's not some higher thing that he's looking for. According to the basic argument, it makes no difference whether determinism is true or false. We cannot be truly or ultimately morally responsible for our actions in either case. He says, the basic argument has variations expressed in the literature of free will, and its central idea can be quickly conveyed. Very quickly conveyed. It has two premises and a conclusion. 1, nothing can be causa sui, which is to say that nothing can be the cause of itself. Premise 2, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be causa sui, at least in certain crucial mental respects. Therefore, nothing can be truly morally responsible. It's a very nice, neat, simple argument that he unpacks a little bit moving forward. Now, libertarians would object to premise 1. Compatibilists would object to premise 2. P.F. Strawson, his father, would object to premise 2. He lays it out in, I think, it's a better form. It's a better form here in the next section. Well, not the next section, but just the next paragraph. He says, essentially the same argument can be given in a more natural form. 1, it is undeniable that one is the way one is initially as a result of heredity and early experience, and it is undeniable that these are things for which one cannot be held to be morally responsible for. Now, that's obvious. Premise 2, one cannot at any later stage of life hope to accede to true moral responsibility for the way one is by trying to change the way one already is as a result of heredity and previous experience. Basically saying you can't overcome your constitution. Like that doesn't even make any sense. Like you'd have to believe in like some ghost in the machine to be able to like through the power of sheer will like override these things.
Like the ghost only wakes up after a few years or something.
Yeah, it's like I mean, this is like if you believe that, it's like you almost have to be saying kind of impossible things. It's like, for instance, if someone was born with like no legs, like just choose to walk. Like
pick yourself up by your bootstraps, son.
And like that's a caricature example, but then you look at it again, it's like, well, okay, well, then they're born with Down syndrome, and it's like, can you just choose to be like an astrophysicist at that point? Like, no, you can't. And like that's a hard truth to swallow. But then we move to like, okay, what if you were born with like an 87 IQ? It's like, can you just choose to be like smart enough to be an astrophysicist? No, like, you know what I mean? So it's just you can do the same thing that Pereboom does with any of those cases. You start with, obviously, if you're not born with legs, you can't choose to walk and move it to anything else. So premise 3, for both the particular way in which one is moved to try to change oneself and the degree of one's success in one's attempt at change will be determined by how one already is as a result of hereditary and previous experience. I love that one. That one's one of my favorites because it's so crucial to lay that out. Like, this is what a lot of people don't get, I think, when you initially first talk to them about free will. It's like, even whether you're successful in the change, that's even out of your control. You know what I mean? It's like, even if you want to change, like, you're overweight and you want to lose weight. Well, like, whether you do or not, it's not even up to you. You know what I mean? It's like, because if it was, you'd do it. You'd never fail at anything. Like, if it was just up to you.
yeah, like I want to do this. I want to do this. It is done.
It's done.
Like that honestly is like the only
Yeah,
like absurd example, just like where you're just like a god figure.
yeah.
It is.
It's done. It's hard to conceive of how you could fail at anything then, you know? Like if you
Right.
don't buy that premise. Okay, so and 4, any further changes that one can in fact bring about only after one has brought about certain initial changes will be in turn determined via the initial changes by heredity and previous experience. You can always walk it back. 5, this may not be the whole story, for it may be that some changes in the way one is traceable not to heredity and experience, but to the influence of indeterministic or random causes. But it is absurd to suppose that indeterministic or random causes for which one is ex hypothesi is in no way responsible can in themselves contribute in any way to one's being truly morally responsible for how one is, which is just to say, randomness doesn't get you freedom or responsibility either. The claim then is that people cannot change the way they are. This, to me, this line of argumentation corrupts what I think is the crux of it. The sense of could have done otherwise. Like there's no sense, if you buy all of those premises, there's no sense in which anyone could have done other than they did. Or that if they did, it's due to randomness, which doesn't give you anything that you can hang your hat on either. Now, not being able to do otherwise, for me, looks like being compelled or compulsion, right? Like you're helpless but to do the thing you do. Now, I take it that neither of you have any objections to those argumentations, right?
Not the argumentation. I did think it sounded a little weird to my ears when you said compulsion, but that might just be, more of a semantic issue there.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, so I should say, when I say compulsion, I'm broadening the definition from Pereboom's first case to include everything up until his 4th case.
Okay, so including like genetics and everything. Okay.
Yeah, it's basically saying you're compelled instead of by a team of neuroscientists by your genetics or by whatever,
Fine, yeah, that's fine.
So can you repeat your question, Jordan? Now that you've clarified.
Oh, I was just making sure that there were no demurrings from either of you on that line of argumentation. So he summarizes nicely. He says the claim is only that people cannot be supposed to change themselves in a way as to become or be or truly become ultimately morally responsible for the way that they are and hence for their actions. So he's just obliterating any sense that we have, any hope that we have for moral responsibility. Now, this is funny. He says, he's encountered 2 main reactions to the basic argument. He says, on one hand, it convinces almost all of the students with whom I have discussed the topic of free will and moral responsibility. On the other hand, it often tends to be dismissed in contemporary discussions of free will and moral responsibility as wrong, which I would take it libertarians would say, or irrelevant, which I know his father, P.F. Strawson, would say. He said, or fatuous or too rapid or an expression of metaphysical megalomania. A compatibilist like his father would say, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not very interesting. It's not central to the moral responsibility debate. Now, I'm just curious. I don't want to give away the punchline of the P.F. Strawson paper because we might do it in the series, but I'm just curious to either of you, can you conceive, like put yourself in the mind frame of a compatibilist about moral responsibility here? Like what, if you wanted to resist his conclusion and preserve some sense of moral responsibility, what if I forced you to make that argument, what would you hang your hat on there? In other words, how it's difficult.
How would I argue, like, if I were a compatibilist?
Sure. How, if you were forced let's pretend it's a writing example or something, if you were
a good old debate where I get points for how well I can argue.
Sure. If you hoped to say that all of this is irrelevant to whether we were deserving of more responsibility or not, what would you say if you had to?
It's a very interesting question, Jordan. Well, perhaps you mentioned it earlier, but like the basic argument case 2, in order to be truly morally responsible, you would have to be casa sui.
Yep, Kazusui.
At least in crucial mental aspects. I would probably just, if I was forced, kind of hang my hat there and just discuss. I mean, it may devolve into semantics, frankly, but I think that's kind of where I would discuss.
Tell me how though. So how
That's so difficult, actually.
it is? I want to force you to just try to be a little. I'm going to exercise your argumentation skills a little bit here.
I mean, I'm trying to go in the direction of like, kind of, I guess like just subverting like the main argument, where like the main argument's like referring to like ultimate moral responsibility, and I don't think anyone can deny that. Like, I mean, maybe you are going for like a denial of that claim, but maybe some sense of moral responsibility you could retain, just based on like assessing someone. Like, I guess you'd have to ignore all the factors that went into making someone who they are, and then just assess them based on who they are now. So, but I don't know. You'll have to give us the punchline here. What is it?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't. Well, I don't want to give you the punchline of the Strawson essay in case we do it, because it's actually open to debate, like what that paper is claiming. So I don't want to. I don't want to force my interpretation onto you.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to debate against like the two-line syllogism that we both all of us agree to both points.
Well,
like,
you definitely can't find it invalid because it clearly is, but you might be able to find it unsound. I thought that actually already we got an interesting distinction where Adam, you interestingly honed in on the status of truly or ultimate moral responsibility, whereas Giffen thought it might be easier to debate that the status of being Kazusui was what mattered for it, which is an interesting distinction.
That's true, but I'm really at a loss for like.
Which is fair. I just wanted to kind of force you guys to be a little uncomfortable for a minute and try to think it through.
Success, overwhelming success.
Okay, nice. He gives us a bit of a hint. So I'll read what Galen says later in section 2. He says, the only way in which one might hope to show that the basic argument was not central to the free will or moral responsibility debate would be to show that the issue of moral responsibility was not central to the free will debate. Now that's an interesting one. You could it's similar to what I've been saying. Now, I obviously was not making that objection. The reason why I find this compelling is actually not even explicitly stated by Galen Strawson here. I find this compelling because it corrupts any sense of could have done otherwise. Right? Like I don't know how you get around the claim that if you could not have done or thought or wanted or had the emotion of whatever happened, I mean, that throws free will out the window, obviously. But then how can you be morally responsible? I mean, like how? If you can't have done or thought or felt otherwise, in what sense are you deeply deserving of blame? I can't come up with one. But I suppose that Galen Strawson himself says that if you want to argue with that, that might be the place to do it, is that.
You've got to give us the bit at this point. We got to hear it. With P.O. Strawson, we got to hear it.
No, I refuse to. Because the problem is that if we do that paper, here's the thing. If we decide we don't want to do that paper, yeah, I'll give it to you. But if we decide to do it, such a rich part of reading that paper is trying to decide what he's actually saying.
Is that the only paper you've read that made a compelling case for moral responsibility outside of the syllogism that Galen Strawson has provided?
In a very almost to answer that might be to give away what I think about it.
Adam's just trying to do that at that point.
I'll give you a hint in as non-committal a way as I can. Yes, with a massive asterisk next to it. In that there is an extremely soft sense in which his point is correct, but I do not agree with the paper overall.
Okay, so it sounds like it'll be. I don't know. I don't know.
It's not.
Sounds like some redefining is going to happen here.
No, I don't think so at all.
Okay.
Well,
But
now we have to do it.
Yes. Okay, we'll definitely do it. It's a landmark paper in this area, so we should do it. Oh, this was something that I thought was actually really important to kind of close. I actually think that Galen makes a mistake in section 3 of this paper, though. He says, I don't think it's sort of like a fatal mistake. I think it's maybe more of a stylistic mistake. So he waits until section 3 to talk about what actually he means, like what sort of responsibility is under discussion. He says it's important to try to be precise about what sort of responsibility is under discussion. What sort of true moral responsibility is being said to be both impossible and widely believed in. He says, now this is where I think he makes a mistake. He says, an old story is very helpful in clarifying this question. This is the story of heaven and hell. As I understand it, true moral responsibility is responsibility of such a kind that if we have it, then it makes sense, at least, to suppose that it could be just to punish some of us with eternal torment in hell and reward others with eternal bliss in heaven. This is where I think he makes a mistake, because I think it's all too easy to say, well, I'm a compatibilist. I believe in moral responsibility, and I don't think anyone should be sent to hell, which is fair. Like, I don't think that's an incoherent position to have. I think he didn't need to bring in that story or analogy. I think it's overkill. I think what he should have done is just bring out the sense that what we're doing when we talk about moral responsibility, we're not talking about attributability or causality in the sense that like a rocket's fuel propulsion is responsible for it escaping terminal velocity, right? Or hitting escape velocity. That's saying like that's almost like a descriptive account. That's not what we're talking about when we say moral responsibility. What we're talking about here is whether or not someone is deserving of blame. And I think it's actually kind of crucial to isolate actions from attitudes, because that's why I didn't like because he conflated them a little bit here. Like sending someone to hell is an action. I think that instead he should have focused on the attitudes that we have towards people when we say that they're morally responsible. Like, is there a deep sense in which you deserve praise or blame morally for your actions?
Well, I think it actually brings up a pretty interesting point there. I mean, I think torment in hell and eternal bliss in heaven is a bit of a, because I mean, obviously you can still reject that if you accept moral responsibility and say it's actually an unjust response.
Yes.
But I think like the concept of punishment is an interesting thing to bring up in this argument here, just like because it's honestly less to do with I mean it has to do with our attitudes toward that person, but also in a sense that to be morally responsible, I feel like that entails that there are moral consequences to one's actions. You could maybe argue that if you think that someone's morally responsible for like maybe killing your father, that there is reason to think that there should be some sort of punishment to that as well.
I'm not sure I like that.
Can I explain? There's a distinction in the literature. The problem is that you could have consequentialist reasons for punishment that don't hinge on you believing in a deep sense of moral responsibility.
No. That's probably the inverse of my point there, because obviously that there are like societal reasons for punishing people, even if you don't believe in moral responsibility. I'm saying that if you believe in moral responsibility, then maybe a conclusion to that would be that punishment is justifiable.
But I think it's maybe there. Like I don't. That's why I'm saying I don't think you should. Not you, but Strawson. Galen Strawson should focus on this sort of the action side of it, or like the punishment side of it. That's a question. It's just that's an open question. And I think by giving people like the wiggle room to say like, well, I don't believe in like capital punishment or people should be sent to hell. So like like I said, I think it's a stylistic mistake.
Those are specific punishments. I'm talking about like
punishment generally.
Punishment generally.
But
like,
I even think that's a different question.
Is that a coherent concept? Like, say we, take out a, consequentialist viewpoint. We just take that out of the picture and we say that, like, it doesn't actually help society if we punish. Like, it doesn't get people off the streets. It doesn't deter crime. All that's thrown out. Is there some coherent reason to punish people if you adhere to like moral responsibility?
I think to be a true advocate of moral responsibility in a deep sense, you have to say yes.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I'm just saying, but I don't like the debate being framed that way because from that perspective, the action is a consequent of the attitude, right? So like, I think we should separate because the problem is there's I understand it's not what you were saying, but there's any possibility of any given action for any like attitude towards someone, right? So I think that the debate should focus first about like the attitudes that result from what you think about moral responsibility.
Okay, I just think it's the logical next step.
Well, Jordan, can you clarify your belief a little bit more on like attitude?
Well, I'm using the language actually of I'm beginning to creep into the language of P.F. Strawson's paper.
I see.
So he talks about the
veil stays up.
Well, no, I can speak about it without using his terminology, I guess. It's just I find his terminology actually helpful in clarifying this. But sure. My point is that there are philosophers who maintain a distinction between believing in moral responsibility and conceding that punishment generally follows from that. Or
I agree.
we're focusing on the negative side of it, but you can flip it. You can say that if you do like a morally outstanding action, you deserve praise for it, and you can maintain the distinction between praise in the attitudinal sense from praise as like an action or something you do as a consequence of it. So I just think it's clarifying to focus on the attitudes that result from how you view moral responsibility.
I actually am not sure if I understand fully the distinction between attitude and action in this case. Because to me, like at least on first blush, an attitude that is being taken kind of implies some sort of action.
Not necessarily. Like, so for instance, let's say.
So we're talking about like other people in this case, right? For there to be attitudes towards like the person who is morally responsible for the thing. It's other people's attitudes towards. Right.
Yeah, you could believe that someone. So you could not buy Galen's argument here and say, no, I believe in a deep sense of moral responsibility. But you could also be a consequentialist ethically and say, so you could have the attitude, this person deserves deep blame, but for some consequentialist reason, punishing him for it would result in a worse consequence for the world. Don't make me spell like let's just bracket.
Okay. Yeah.
So it could be superseded by that ethical concern.
Okay. I did not understand what you meant by attitude. I think that clarifies it a bit.
Yes. So I'm saying let's talk about, because I think there's a rich like discussion to be had about like what you do with an attitude, once you have it. But the attitude seems to be a direct result from what you think about the moral responsibility case.
I was misinterpreting what you meant by attitude, because to me, like attitude implied like the way people like socially treat a person.
Yeah, I'm just saying intentional attitude as a direct.
I do see what you're saying now.
Okay.
That is interesting.
To close the loop, I don't want to be pedantic, but like, do you get what I'm saying, Adam?
I think I do. I think I do.
Okay. Okay.
I think we may not have heard each other entirely on that one, but I think I know where you're coming from, though.
Okay, it's definitely possible. I think I understand what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing with it kind of from my personal stance. Like, I do agree with what you're saying, but from the larger kind of 30,000 view, I don't want to conflate attitude as a result of how you see moral responsibility with action, just because there are possibilities. I don't follow them, but there are possibilities of branches there.
Sure, and I also get what you were saying, that obviously other frameworks that you operate under and buy into can supersede, whether you act on the conclusion of moral responsibility, that punishment is, given everything else held off on the side, like consequences and how that all affects society and human behavior. I do think punishment does follow from moral responsibility. So
yes. Okay, I agree with that. Yeah, I was just saying I find it clarifying to talk in terms of the attitudes that result instead of the consequences.
Sure.
Okay, nice. I really enjoyed the Nietzsche quote later in the paper on page 315. Just indulge me. I want to read the Nietzsche quote because I just think it's good writing. This is Galen introducing it. He says, "The causa sui is the best self-contradiction that has been conceived so far," as Nietzsche remarked in 1886. "It is a sort of rape and perversion of logic, but the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly and frightfully with just this nonsense. The desire for freedom of the will in the superlative metaphysical sense, which holds sway, unfortunately, in the minds of the half-educated, the desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself, and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance, and society involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui, and with more than Baron Munchausen's audacity, to pull oneself up by the existence, by the hair, out of the swamps of nothingness." Quoted from Beyond Good and Evil. Like I just love that quote. Like his disdain.
It's absurd.
It's such a good quote. I love it.
I love the end there. It's just what a great way to end. To pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the swamps of nothingness.
I love it. I should clarify for you guys. I don't disagree with anything in this paper. Any sense, like I said, I don't want to give it away, but in the tiny, very soft, one could argue not even conforming. Well, I like part of my writing sample is critiquing P.F. Strawson's paper. In the only way that I see a value in that is not in the way he intends it. So I am not objecting to, I think, this excellent paper by the younger Galen Strawson. I'll just read, there's two tiny quotes that I think he ends it with perfectly. He says, "Punishments and rewards may seem deeply appropriate or intrinsically fitting to us in spite of this argument." Now, we can discuss that in later readings. He's basically alluding to a consequentialist framework here. But he says, to conclude it, "The evident consequence of the basic argument is that there is a fundamental sense in which no punishment or reward is ever ultimately just. It is exactly as just to punish or reward people for their actions as it is to punish or reward them for the natural color of their hair or the natural shape of their faces." I think that's not the last line of the paper, but I think that that's the line we should end on, because I do, like, yes, I agree with that. Like, I don't know how you could disagree with that, honestly. Like, it really is just as odd or as unjust for me to punish someone for their disposition or a result of their disposition as it is for me to punish them for the color of their hair.
Like, in a perverse sense, you can imagine someone saying it's just to do both.
I don't know anyone who argues for that. I mean, that's
in the past, perhaps.
Oh, okay, yeah. In the past. I mean,
that's what I'm alluding to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean,
slavery. Nietzsche's half-educated crowd there.
It holds. What did he say? He says, "It still holds sway, unfortunately, in the minds of the half-educated." Oh, I love that. I love that. It's funny. I mean, like this actually, it's not in Beyond Good and Evil, but it's in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I think. This actually really ties in with his concept of slave morality. Like he is almost alluding to that here. Like, don't you get the sense that some people actually want to bear that responsibility for like, so some people like, it is this weird kind of slave morality-esque desire that like, I mean, I think it's most common in Christians for sure, right? Like I mean, do you agree with that, Adam? Like, it seems like from a Christian point of view, like you do almost kind of want to have the weight of the moral universe on your shoulders in that sense.
Yeah, because I mean,
so otherwise hell doesn't make any sense.
But then also like a perfect God doesn't make a lot of sense either, and and that's more important to maintain that, especially with the get out of jail free card. Like that you bear all the weight of your moral failings, but you kind of don't at the same time. So
yeah.
I feel like if we were talking about like individuals who like want to like hold on to this, it's like like hold on to like the struggle, like the responsibility, because like they feel like their own greatness, which is probably exaggerated, like is lessened by kind of rejecting it, which it kind of is.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. Like you're not so great. Like you didn't have a choice.
Yeah, that's pretty true.
That's a good point.
And and there's exaggerating it anyways. Go on.
Yeah. Well, there's a nice question that I maybe unintentionally brought up there, Giffen, but like a lot of people make a fuss about there being an asymmetry between the positive and negative consequences of disavowing moral responsibility, in the sense that clearly it's never just to blame someone, but people descriptively do tend to hang on to the positive attitudes of moral responsibility, things like praise or empathy or something like that. Just an interesting remark.
That is interesting.
Yeah. So some people make a big deal of that asymmetry. I find that asymmetry to be a very happy one. Like, let's eschew all of these kind of nonsensical like attributions of blame for things over which people clearly could not have done otherwise. But yeah, let's keep the good parts about it. Like, it's like I don't see that as an unhappy one. I guess you could make the argument that that's, and I'm not saying that we keep it in a deep sense, but I'm just saying like, because you could accuse me of being not consistent, I suppose.
Well, I mean, I think it ties in nicely with Nagel's moral luck as well.
All right. Well, I think that we've covered it nicely. We kind of have to do the P.F. Strawson paper after this.
We do.
Next, yeah. All right, nice. Well, we'll do it. I hope this was interesting, maybe enjoyable, and tune in next time for the Elder Strawson's paper.